Okay, 8th grade. I had quite a few students reach out and ask if I could create and post some videos for lessons 8.1 and 8.2. For lesson 8.1, these are notes that we took in class the last day we actually had math class before we had our school closing. So if you want to follow along with these, they are going to be in your notebook. I can also post them for you as well if I don't forget to do that. For 8.1, the first part of these notes were about just simplifying and getting used to some basic rational expressions, and then we did multiplication and division. So for this first video, we're going to focus on just simplifying them, and then in the next video, we'll start worrying about multiplying and dividing. For simplifying, for the sake of this recap purpose, I'm going to skip the restrictions piece. I think we've had plenty of practice with that. It comes back up in lessons 8.3 and 8.4, as you saw in those videos dealing with asymptotes. So the restrictions, that means it could be phrased as restrictions in the domain. It could be phrased as for what values is the function undefined. Those are all different ways to say what values would give you 0 in the denominator. Okay, so you can see on this one, if you set this equal to 0 and solve, you'd get 3 of them. So from here on out, I'm going to skip that piece and just focus on the simplifying. The first step when simplifying, multiplying, dividing, adding, or subtracting is to factor. You want to factor everything you can. So here in guided practice 1A, the entire numerator is factored for us. The denominator, we have a little bit we could factor. Factors of -6 that add to -1 would be a -3 and a +2. Once you have everything factored, you can cancel out all common factors between the numerator and the denominator, because dividing any number by itself is equal to 1. Y divided by y minus 3 divided by y minus 3. So cancel out everything you can, and what you're left with is going to be your simplified answer. We don't need to simplify the numerator by using the distributive property. If you spend all this time factoring, you don't want to have to do more work. You will see in lesson 8.2, when we combine using addition and subtraction, you will need to do some simplifying in the numerator to make sure you couldn't keep going. But when you just have one fraction that you're asked to simplify, you don't need to do that extra step. Here in part B, we have still just one fraction. It looks a lot more complex because there's a lot more factors in it. But we take the same approach. So the only thing that we have left to factor is this set of parentheses here, this trinomial. Factors of -8 that add to a +2 would be a +4 and a -2. Everything else is already in its completely factored form, so we just rewrite everything else as is. And again, we cancel out any common factors, and we have our remaining factors left for our answer. Okay. I have a note here that I would have told you guys out loud, but you wouldn't have written down. You can keep any factors in parentheses to stay organized. So if you want to put the 2z and the z minus 1 in parentheses, you can. There's no issue with that. It just might look a little over cluttered at times, but if it helps you stay more organized, then you can definitely use those. Guided practice 2, again, was the restriction, so we're going to skip that one for now. And then got it 3. Got it 3 here looks slightly different because now we have some other just properties of exponents popping in. There's not as many sets of parentheses, but it's the same approach. So in part A, all we can factor out in the numerator is a z. Everything in the denominator is factored. Cancel what we can. Notice here we have an x minus 4 and a 4 minus x. Anytime you have the same values within a factor, but you have them in different orders, you would want to factor out a -1. So that's what we did from this step to this step. I factored out a -1, which would essentially make that -1 times -4 plus x. But that looks better when you think of it as x minus 4, which is why I wrote it that way in this last step here. -1 pops out front as a coefficient with the z. Now we can continue to simplify. So that's where these simplifying ones get the trickiest, dealing with negatives. And then we have z divided by z squared. You would subtract your exponents. Your x minus 4s would cancel out, and your whole expression is negative. Okay, so that same idea pops up here in part B. In the numerator, we can take out an a and a b. Denominator is already factored, but as you notice here, we have a b minus 5 and a 5 minus b. So again, we can take that and factor out a negative 1. It changes the signs inside your parentheses, and it's always better on the eyes to see it as b minus 5 instead of negative 5 plus b. So I put it down as b minus 5, and I took that negative out front. Canceled out what they had in common and wrote my final answer. And you might notice here, I went ahead and left the parentheses with my 5 plus b. Since that's the only factor down there, you don't need it. But for some reason on this problem, to me, it looked better with it. Okay, so that wraps up just the simplifying when you're dealing with rational expressions with one fraction. The next video will look at multiplying multiple fractions.